The steel door slams shut behind Hugo Pinell for the 43rd time that year. But this time something is different. After more than 4 decades in a concrete box measuring 8 feet by 10 feet, the 71-year-old man known as Yogi is finally being released into general population at California State Prison, Sacramento. His hands shake as he steps into the yard, not from fear but from the knowledge that his body has forgotten how to exist around other human beings. Within hours he will be dead, murdered by inmates who've been waiting for this exact moment. The question isn't why he was killed. The question is why the state of California finally let him out after 46 years of solitary confinement, knowing exactly what would happen. This is the story of Pelican Bay's security housing unit, a place where the punishment wasn't just isolation. It was a systematic psychological experiment that would eventually face one of the largest class action lawsuits in prison history. And Hugo Pinell was just one of thousands who became test subjects. The year is 2015. After decades of legal battles, California's Department of Corrections has just agreed to a historic settlement. Indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang affiliation is now illegal. Thousands of men who've spent years, sometimes decades, in the SHU are about to learn if their minds can survive freedom. Most of them entered these cells as young men. They're leaving as something else entirely. But before we understand the settlement, we need to go back. Back to 1989, when Pelican Bay State Prison first opened its doors in the remote forests of Northern California. Back to when the SHU was being sold to the public as the solution to gang violence. Back to when correctional officers believed they were creating the most secure facility in American history. They had no idea they were building a machine that would break the human mind in ways that couldn't be undone.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
Pelican Bay State Prison wasn't supposed to exist in the middle of nowhere. That was the entire point. When California broke ground in 1989, the state spent $217.5 million constructing what corrections officials called a Supermax facility on 275 acres of land near Crescent City, a logging town so remote that it sits just 20 miles from the Oregon border. The nearest major city, San Francisco, is a 6-hour drive south. Families wanting to visit inmates would need to travel through dense redwood forests on winding 2-lane highways, past towns that barely registered on maps. The isolation wasn't accidental. It was strategic. The Security Housing Unit, the SHU, occupied its own separate building within the complex. From the outside, it looked like a concrete bunker designed to withstand a military assault. Inside, it contained 1,056 individual cells arranged in pods, each one identical, 8 feet wide, 10 feet long. Poured concrete bed. Stainless steel toilet and sink combination. A single fluorescent light that never turned off. One tiny window made of thick security glass that let in almost no natural light. The architects called it state-of-the-art. Human rights organizations would later call it a sensory deprivation chamber. Todd Ashker arrived at Pelican Bay's SHU in 1990, 1 year after the facility opened. He was 24 years old, serving a life sentence for murder, and had been validated as an associate of the Aryan Brotherhood prison gang. Validation didn't require proof of criminal activity. It required 3 source items, which could include tattoos, drawings found in a cell, a letter from another validated gang member, or a correctional officer's testimony about who someone talked to in the prison yard. Once validated, an inmate went to the SHU. The only way out was to debrief, provide information about gang members and activities. For many inmates, debriefing meant becoming a target for the rest of their lives. So they stayed. Ashker would spend the next 28 years in solitary confinement. The daily routine in the SHU was designed for absolute control. Inmates remained in their cells for 22.5 hours per day. 3 times weekly, they were allowed 90 minutes in an individual exercise yard, a concrete box slightly larger than their cell, covered by metal grating instead of a roof. They called these spaces dog runs. Showers occurred in the cell 3 times per week, water controlled remotely by guards. All meals arrived through a slot in the steel door. Human contact was limited to brief exchanges with correctional officers during cell searches or handcuffing procedures. Inmates in adjacent cells could sometimes talk through air vents, but the SHU's design minimized even this interaction. The pods were constructed to amplify sound in disorienting ways. Voices echoed and distorted, making it difficult to hold conversations or even identify where sounds originated. The psychological impact manifested within months. Pelican Bay's own medical records documented inmates experiencing hallucinations, hearing voices, losing the ability to concentrate, and developing what psychologists called SHU syndrome, a constellation of symptoms including hypersensitivity to stimuli, paranoia, and difficulty processing information. Some men forgot how to hold conversations. Others compulsively paced their cells, walking the same 8-foot path thousands of times per day until their shoes wore through. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychologist from UC Santa Cruz, would later testify that the conditions in Pelican Bay's SHU were strikingly toxic and produced psychological trauma comparable to physical torture. But in 1990 the system was just getting started. And men like Todd Ashker were about to discover that years could turn into decades without anyone noticing. By 1993 Pelican Bay's SHU held over 1,200 inmates in near total isolation. The average stay was supposed to be temporary, a few months, maybe a year for the most dangerous cases. Instead, men were entering the SHU in their 20s and still there in their 40s. The first major warning came from inside the system itself. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist from Harvard Medical School, was granted access to Pelican Bay's SHU in 1993 to evaluate inmates for a federal lawsuit. What he documented would become crucial evidence in Madrid versus Gomez, a case that challenged the entire SHU system. Gracian interviewed dozens of inmates and found a consistent pattern. After just 60 days in solitary confinement, prisoners began experiencing severe psychiatric symptoms regardless of their mental health history before entering the SHU. The symptoms were disturbingly uniform. Inmates reported vivid hallucinations, seeing shadows move across walls, hearing voices calling their names, feeling insects crawling on their skin that weren't there. Many developed what Gracian termed perceptual distortions. Time became impossible to track. Some men couldn't tell if they'd been in their cell for hours or days. Others became hypersensitive to sound. A guard's footsteps in the corridor would send their heart racing. A door slamming would trigger panic attacks. Von Dorch, a prisoner who spent years in Pelican Bay's SHU, later testified that he began talking to himself because the silence was unbearable. He created elaborate conversations with imaginary people just to hear human voices, even if they were his own. When guards placed him in 4-point restraints after a mental breakdown, he couldn't remember what he'd done to trigger the response. Chunks of time simply vanished from his memory. The restraint chair became a common sight in the SHU. Prisoners experiencing psychotic episodes were strapped into a metal chair designed to immobilize every part of their body. Arms, legs, torso, even their head. They could remain restrained for hours, sometimes in nothing but underwear, in cells kept deliberately cold. Medical staff documented these interventions as crisis management. Mental health advocates called it torture. Judge Thelton Henderson, presiding over Madrid versus Gomez, visited Pelican Bay personally in 1995. What he saw shocked him enough to issue a scathing 400-page ruling. Henderson found that conditions in the SHU violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment, specifically for inmates with serious mental illness. The sensory deprivation, social isolation, and lack of meaningful activity created an environment that was virtually guaranteed to inflict serious psychological harm. But Henderson's ruling had a fatal limitation. He only banned housing inmates with pre-existing serious mental illness in the SHU. Prisoners who arrived mentally healthy, men like Todd Ashker, could still be held indefinitely, even as isolation destroyed their minds. The state's response was minimal. Pelican Bay added a few hours of programming, allowed some prisoners access to radios, and created a step-down program that theoretically allowed inmates to progress toward general population. In practice, very few made it through. The criteria for advancement remained vague, and gang validation kept most SHU prisoners locked in place. By the late 1990s, Pelican Bay's SHU had become a laboratory for studying sensory deprivation on a massive scale. The difference between scientific experiments and what happened at Pelican Bay was simple. In legitimate research, subjects could withdraw at any time. In the SHU there was no way out. And Hugo Pinell, the elderly man from San Quentin, had already been in solitary confinement for over 25 years when Judge Henderson issued his ruling. He had 20 more years to go. On July 1, 2011, 30,000 inmates across California's prison system stopped eating. The hunger strike began in Pelican Bay's SHU, organized by 4 men who should have been enemies. Todd Ashker, a validated Aryan Brotherhood member. Sitawa Nantambujama, validated with the Black Guerrilla family. Antonio Guillen, validated with Nuestra Familia. and Danny Troxel, another validated gang member. These men came from groups that had spent decades killing each other in California's prison yards. Now they were working together, communicating through a network of smuggled notes called kites, that moved between cells through elaborate systems involving fishing lines and air vents. Their demands were specific. End group punishment based on gang validation. Allow inmates one phone call per year. Provide warm clothing in the SHU's perpetually cold environment. Stop forcing cellmates together as a debriefing tactic, a practice that put validated gang members in cells with their enemies, creating violent situations that correctional officers documented as proof the inmates were too dangerous for general population. But the core demand was simpler: end indefinite solitary confinement. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation insisted the strike involved only a few hundred inmates. Independent monitors documented numbers closer to 30,000 across multiple facilities. Prisoners organized in waves. Some would eat to avoid medical intervention, then resume striking in coordination with others. The protest lasted 3 weeks before most participants ended it based on promises from prison officials to review policies. Nothing changed. On September 26, 2011, inmates struck again. This time 12,000 participated. The strike lasted 2 weeks. Again officials promised reviews. Again nothing substantive changed. The third strike began on July 8, 2013, and it nearly killed everyone involved. This time prisoners were prepared for the long term. They'd spent months organizing, coordinating across racial lines in an unprecedented show of unity. Billy Cell, validated with the Aryan Brotherhood, stopped eating alongside Latino and black prisoners in a movement that defied every gang boundary California corrections had spent decades enforcing. The strike spread beyond Pelican Bay to 24,000 inmates across the state system. Weeks passed. Then months. Medical experts warned that prolonged starvation causes irreversible organ damage. After 40 days without food, the body begins consuming muscle tissue, including the heart. Several strikers developed critical health conditions: kidney failure, severe dehydration, dramatic weight loss. Paul Red, a prisoner at Corcoran State Prison, lost over 60 pounds. His family described him as barely recognizable during visits. The state filed court orders seeking authority to force-feed strikers. Human rights organizations argued that force-feeding violated medical ethics and international law. The standoff intensified. On day 60, with strikers' health deteriorating critically, legislators finally intervened. California State Senator Lonnie Hancock held hearings on solitary confinement. Families of SHU prisoners testified about visiting loved ones who couldn't remember their children's names, who flinched at human touch, who developed severe mental illness from years of isolation. The strike ended on September 5, 2013, after 60 days. But this time the promises came with legal backing. The state agreed to serious policy review. More importantly, prisoners and their advocates had already filed what would become the defining legal challenge: Ashker versus Governor of California. Todd Ashker, the man who'd entered the SHU in 1990, was now the lead plaintiff in a class-action lawsuit representing thousands of inmates. The case argued that indefinite solitary confinement based solely on gang validation, without any specific disciplinary violation, violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The trial was set for 2015. After 25 years in the SHU, Ashker would finally have his day in court. But the question remained: would his mind survive long enough to see it? The settlement came on September 1, 2015, just days before the case was scheduled to go to trial. After months of mediation, California's Department of Corrections agreed to terms that would fundamentally reshape solitary confinement in the state's prison system. Gang validation alone could no longer justify indefinite SHU placement. Inmates could only be sent to isolation for specific rule violations, and even then their time would be limited. The agreement affected nearly 3,000 prisoners who'd been held in the SHU solely based on gang affiliation, some for decades. Todd Ashker, who'd spent 28 years and 10 months in solitary confinement, was finally cleared for release to general population. So was Danny Troxel, after 29 years in the SHU. Sidawa Nantambujama, 23 years. Antonio Guillen, 22 years. But the settlement created an immediate problem that everyone saw coming and nobody prevented. Men who'd been isolated from human contact for decades were suddenly being released into general population yards where gang politics still controlled every interaction. Some of these prisoners had debriefed to gain their release, meaning they'd provided information about gang activities to authorities. In prison culture, debriefing carries a death sentence. Even prisoners who hadn't debriefed faced danger. Decades in the SHU meant they'd lost all gang protection, all alliances, all knowledge of current yard politics. They were completely vulnerable. Hugo Yogi Pinell had been in some form of solitary confinement since 1971, 44 years. He was a member of the San Quentin Six, a group of inmates involved in a violent 1971 escape attempt that left 6 people dead, including 3 correctional officers and legendary prison activist George Jackson. Pinell had been convicted of killing Officer Sergeant John Mills during that incident. His supporters insisted he was a political prisoner, targeted for his association with the Black Panther Party and the prison reform movement. Critics called him an exceptionally violent inmate who'd assaulted multiple guards throughout his incarceration. What wasn't disputed was that Pinell had spent more time in solitary confinement than almost anyone in California's prison system. He'd entered as a young man and emerged at age 71, his hair completely white, his body aged by decades without sunlight or exercise beyond a concrete box. On August 12, 2015, just weeks before the settlement was officially approved, Pinell was transferred to California State Prison, Sacramento, and released into general population for the first time in over 4 decades. He lasted less than 3 hours. During an organized yard release, multiple inmates attacked Pinell simultaneously. He was stabbed repeatedly, suffering fatal wounds. Correctional officers responded, but by the time they secured the yard, Pinell was dead. Prison officials stated that the attack appeared pre-planned and coordinated. Several inmates were identified as suspects, but the investigation revealed what everyone already knew. This was a hit that had been authorized at the highest levels of prison gang hierarchy. The question wasn't who killed Hugo Pinell. The question was why prison administrators released a 71-year-old man with 44 years of solitary confinement directly into a general population yard without any transitional protective measures. Anne Irwin, Pinell's lawyer, was blunt in her assessment. They knew exactly what was going to happen. They took a man who'd been completely isolated from other human beings for 4 decades and threw him into a situation where he had no protection, no allies, and no chance. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation issued a statement calling Pinell's death a tragedy but declined to comment on security procedures. Hugo Pinell's death became a brutal illustration of the settlement's central paradox. After destroying prisoners' minds with decades of isolation, the state was releasing them into environments where psychological damage guaranteed they couldn't survive. Chapter 5. The Aftermath of the Experiment. The settlement didn't end solitary confinement in California. It changed the paperwork. By 2017, 2 years after the Ashker settlement, California had reduced its SHU population from nearly 3,000 to fewer than 700 inmates. On paper this looked like victory. But investigations by human rights organizations revealed what actually happened. Prisoners simply got moved to different units with different names. Restrictive custody. Enhanced outpatient program. Administrative segregation pending transfer. The conditions remained nearly identical. 22 hours per day in cells, minimal human contact, indefinite duration. The psychological damage, however, was already done. Dr. Terry Kupers, a psychiatrist who'd evaluated hundreds of SHU prisoners, documented the long-term effects in his research. Men who'd spent years in solitary showed permanent changes in brain function. They struggled with basic social interactions, maintaining eye contact, processing conversations, tolerating proximity to other people. Many experienced what Kupers called social death, the complete inability to form meaningful relationships after release. Some former SHU prisoners requested to be sent back to isolation because general population felt too overwhelming, too chaotic, too dangerous to their fractured mental state. Todd Ashker, released from the SHU after nearly 29 years, described his first weeks in general population as terrifying. Sounds felt amplified. The presence of other people triggered panic attacks. He'd forgotten how to navigate basic social cues, when to speak, how to interpret facial expressions, whether someone approaching meant danger or conversation. His mind had adapted to complete isolation. Now it couldn't adapt back. The financial cost of California's solitary confinement experiment exceeded $60 million annually just for Pelican Bay's SHU operations. But the human cost was incalculable. Families described visiting fathers, brothers, and sons who no longer recognized them. Children grew up visiting parents through thick glass, watching them deteriorate year after year. Some inmates died in the SHU, heart attacks, suicides, medical emergencies that occurred behind steel doors where nobody could hear them calling for help. In 2019, California passed SB 132, further limiting the use of segregated confinement. The law prohibited isolation for more than 15 consecutive days for most inmates, citing mounting evidence that prolonged solitary confinement constitutes torture under international law. It was a significant reform, but it came decades too late for men like Hugo Pinell, who'd spent 44 years in a concrete box before being killed within hours of release. The broader question lingered: what was the point? Gang violence in California prisons continued regardless of how many men were locked in the SHU. The validation system that was supposed to identify dangerous gang leaders had simply created thousands of permanently isolated prisoners, many of whom had minimal actual gang involvement. The recidivism rate for prisoners released from prolonged solitary confinement was higher than for general population inmates. Their psychological damage made successful reintegration into society nearly impossible. Pelican Bay's SHU still exists. On any given day, hundreds of men remain in those 8x10 concrete cells, many serving months or years for violations that in any other context would result in minor disciplinary action. The facility that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of prison security became instead a monument to the limits of human endurance. The Ashker settlement proved that indefinite solitary confinement based on gang validation was unconstitutional. But it couldn't undo what had already been done. It couldn't restore lost decades. It couldn't repair shattered minds. And it couldn't bring Hugo Pinell back to life. The experiment at Pelican Bay answered a question that never needed asking. How much isolation can the human mind endure before it breaks completely? The answer, documented in thousands of ruined lives, was simple: far less than the state of California inflicted.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.